The only sound in the kitchen was the soft clink of Daniel's spoon tapping the edge of his mug. One slow stir, then another, then stillness. I sat across from him, hands folded in my lap. Not clenched, just braced. Like I already knew, like I'd known for a long time, but today would be the day the silence learned how to speak. The sun was leaking through the curtains behind him, tracing golden lines across the side of his face. Lines I used to know like the back of my hand. Lines I once traced at midnight with fingertips full of wonder. But today, all I could see were shadows settling into every groove. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I just hadn't looked in a while. He didn't meet my eyes. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't with anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was something colder. "If I could go back," he said, stirring his coffee once more, "I wouldn't have married you." No build-up, no apology, no explanation, just that. I didn't ask why. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. Because something in me had already heard this hundreds of times in 100 different ways. The birthdays missed, the silence at dinner, the forgotten anniversaries, the way his coffee mug started showing up alone on the counter, already poured, instead of waiting beside mine. There are things that break you with a bang. And then there are things that carve you out quietly over years. This was the latter. I rose from my chair, slowly, careful not to scrape the legs against the floor. The way you move when you're trying not to disturb the last of your dignity. Daniel didn't stop me. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't say anything at all. I didn't pack in a fury. There was no suitcase dragging down the stairs, no door slammed, no yelling. Just a quiet woman who'd finally decided that love shouldn't feel like a daily erasure. Upstairs, our room looked exactly as it always had. Bed made. His shoes aligned perfectly beneath the bench. My robe still hung on the back of the door, soft cotton, a faded floral print. A gift from Claire years ago, a Mother's Day present he'd forgotten. But she hadn't. In the top drawer of my nightstand behind the lavender sachet and the hand cream was an old leather journal. It wasn't pretty anymore, edges curled, corners softened. But it held the only parts of me that ever got to scream. I didn't open it. Not yet, but I held it in both hands like it was the only proof I had ever existed fully. Then I placed it on top of the suitcase, zipped it shut, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. I wasn't angry. I was finished. And finishing isn't loud. It's not explosive. It's a closing door that doesn't even creak. It's the sound of your own name whispered back to you after years of silence. And that morning in the house, where I had raised children and swallowed grief and baked 1,000 loaves of banana bread no one ate, I stood up and chose myself. Have you ever stayed too long where you felt unseen? Subscribe to hear how this story unfolds, because some goodbyes aren't sad. They're sacred. I didn't rush. People expect drama when a woman leaves. Slamming doors, shattered dishes, tears in the driveway. But the truth? Sometimes it looks like careful folding. Sometimes it sounds like the faint hiss of a zipper on a suitcase that hasn't been touched in years. It was the same suitcase I used the last time I visited my sister Helen in Oregon. The tag was still on it. Frayed string, faded print. I'd meant to replace it. But like so many things in my life, it stayed. Just because it still worked. I pulled it from the back of the closet. Dust clung to the top seam. I wiped it with my sleeve, then placed it gently on the bed. I didn't pack much. A few soft sweaters. A nightgown Claire gifted me 3 Christmases ago. Toiletries. My journal? That last one. It sat in the top drawer, half covered by receipts, and an old anniversary card I'd written but never gave to Daniel. The journal's leather was cracked, a little curled at the corners. It had started as a gratitude notebook, and then somewhere it became something else. The first entry was from 1989. Daniel fixed the garage light today without being asked. I love that he sees what needs doing. The handwriting was rounder back then, hopeful. There was a time when I believed small gestures were enough to anchor a life. They were for a while. I placed the journal on top of my clothes, closed the suitcase, sat in the stillness of the room where I'd spent more than half my life, and waited for something. Grief, anger, fear. But all I felt was an odd, unfamiliar lightness. Downstairs, the silence held steady. I could hear Daniel clinking dishes in the sink. A mundane sound. But even that had shifted. It no longer tugged at me like it used to. Once the sound of him in the kitchen was comfort. Now it was distance. I took one last look around the room. The photo of us on our 20th anniversary still stood on the dresser. He was wearing that awful mustard tie. I was in a cream blouse and a smile I barely remember now. We were younger, brighter, but I couldn't help but notice. Even then, we weren't touching in the photo. Just standing side by side, like strangers on the same stage. I didn't take the picture with me. Some memories are heavier than they look. I walked past our bathroom where my robe still hung, past the hall mirror where I barely recognized myself, down the staircase we once decorated with garland every Christmas, and into the foyer where the late morning sun cast gentle patterns across the tile. Daniel didn't look up when I passed the kitchen. He didn't ask where I was going. He didn't say my name. That used to hurt, but now it just confirmed what I already knew. He'd stopped seeing me long before I ever left the house. At the front door, I paused. Not for him, but for me. There's a moment just before you leave a place that shaped you when your breath catches. Not because you want to stay, but because you're finally fully stepping out of the story you were told you had to live. I opened the door, and the wind outside didn't feel coldy. It felt clean. The blue dress still hung at the back of my closet, wrapped in its original dry cleaner's plastic, untouched, unworn, forgotten. Daniel used to say it brought out my eyes. That was years ago, before compliments became extinct and our dinners became separate silences. I don't know what made me reach for it that morning. Maybe I wanted to see if it still fit. Maybe I just wanted to see if I still existed inside something beautiful. I peeled the plastic off and held the dress against me. The fabric was soft, cool to the touch, and surprisingly light. Not like me. I had grown heavier over the years. Not in weight, but in what I carried. The unspoken things. The quiet disappointments. The slow erasure. I slipped it on, zipped it up, and looked at myself in the full-length mirror for the first time in months. There I was, still standing, still shaped like a woman with stories she hadn't told yet. I didn't wear the dress to leave in. I wore it for me, to remember that I used to feel something besides useful. I walked downstairs in it. Daniel didn't look up. He was at the kitchen counter buttering toast, scrolling on his phone. He didn't say a word. Not, "Where are you going?" Not, "You look nice." Not even morning. It was as if I'd turned into a whisper he couldn't hear anymore. I poured myself a cup of coffee. Black. No sugar. Set it down in front of me and sat. He ate his toast. I watched him chew like I'd watched him do 1,000 times before. The familiarity felt foreign now. Like seeing an old photograph of yourself smiling and not remembering why you ever smiled that way. The silence between us wasn't new, but today it felt like a signed contract. After a moment, he finally looked up, but not at me. At the wall clock. "You heading somewhere?" he asked flatly. I took a sip of coffee. Yes. He nodded once, then went back to scrolling. And that was it. No questions. No worry. No hesitation. That kind of indifference doesn't come overnight. It grows in layers between unwashed dishes and missed birthdays, between assuming someone will always be there and never checking to see if they still are. I stood up, placed the mug in the sink, and walked back upstairs. The dress still fit, but this life didn't. Back in the bedroom, I changed into a soft sweater and jeans. Practical, warm, comfortable. I folded the blue dress gently, laid it inside the suitcase between the journal and the cardigan I wore to Nathan's graduation. As I zipped the suitcase, I realized something strange. I wasn't sad. There was grief, yes, but it wasn't grief for Daniel. It was grief for the version of me that waited too long for someone to see her. Downstairs, I slipped on my shoes, tied the laces like I was grounding myself. One breath in, one breath out. I picked up the suitcase, opened the front door, and walked out. Not in anger, not in defiance, but in full sacred silence. There was a time when Daniel used to pour my coffee before I came downstairs. It wasn't grand. It wasn't a love letter, but it was warm, thoughtful, routine. He'd leave the mug on the counter just the way I liked it. Light splash of oat milk, 2 sugars. No words, just presence. But one morning months ago, there was only one cup. His. I remember standing at the bottom of the stairs, waiting. Maybe he forgot, I thought. Maybe he was in a rush. Maybe I'd done something to upset him and didn't know it. So I poured my own cup. Didn't ask. Didn't mention it. That was the beginning. 100 mornings passed like that. His cup on the counter, mine missing. And then came the mornings where we didn't even acknowledge each other. He'd breeze past me with a muttered got emails before disappearing into his truck, or the basement, or the screen of his phone. At first, I still made him breakfast. Eggs, toast, sometimes even pancakes. They'd sit on the table, grow cold, and end up in the trash. I stopped cooking them eventually, but it took longer to stop hoping he'd notice I had. What lingered wasn't the empty plate. It was the empty space across the table, the empty glances. The moments where he used to say, "How did you sleep?" and now just scrolled past me like I was part of the furniture. One evening, after a particularly long day, I placed his dinner on the table. Rosemary chicken, roasted carrots, mashed potatoes. He walked in, didn't change out of his work shirt, and said, "That smells heavy." "No, thank you." "No, how was your day?" Just a comment. Dismissive. Like the food was too much work. Like I stared at him for a long moment. But I didn't argue. I didn't push back. I just nodded, sat down quietly, and ate alone. He sat in the living room watching reruns of something he wasn't really interested in while I did the dishes, with hands that had once memorized his back, his shoulders the way he liked the collar of his work shirts pressed. My hands remembered everything, but his eyes, they forgot. I tried once gently. We were folding laundry, something ordinary, and I said, "Do you ever feel lonely, even when we're in the same room?" He frowned like I'd spoken in another language. Then he chuckled and said, "You're too sensitive. You always read into things." That was the last time I asked for more. Because sometimes the worst kind of silence isn't the kind that screams. It's the kind that invalidates your ache with a smile. I started writing letters again in my journal after that. Unsent, of course. Always unsent. "Dear Daniel," I wrote. "Today you looked at the dog longer than you looked at me." I had become something quiet and necessary, like a dishwasher, like a porch light, like static in the background of his real life. And he had become, not cruel, just absent, a ghost that sat at my dinner table. One day I opened the fridge, 2 untouched meals in Tupperware, a note I'd written and taped to the door. "Have a good day." Still there, unread. And I thought, this is how women disappear. Not in car crashes, not in scandals, but in kitchens, in casseroles, in mornings without coffee. That night, I sat on the back porch alone. The garden I tended for years bloomed quietly under the moonlight. Daniel didn't come looking for me, didn't call my name, didn't notice I wasn't in bed. He'd fallen asleep with the television on. I know because I checked, not because I missed him, but because I was still in the habit of making sure he was okay, even when I wasn't. That was the night I knew, not because something broke, but because nothing did, and nothing should feel that heavy. I'd been planning the brunch for weeks. Claire was bringing the twins. Nathan was flying in from Seattle. Even Daniel, to my surprise, had circled the date on the calendar when I first mentioned it. I wanted it to be perfect. Not just for them, for me. I baked blueberry muffins from scratch, the kind I used to make when the kids were little, and would sneak bites of batter when they thought I wasn't looking. I bought fresh flowers from the Sunday market, folded the linen napkins into fans like I saw on a decorating show once. The table was set with our wedding china, the kind that spent most of the year locked behind glass. Too special for every day, but too forgotten to matter anymore. I even curled my hair, wore a soft green blouse Daniel used to say, made my eyes look like spring, spritzed on the perfume he used to buy me for Christmas before he stopped asking what scent I liked. And for a moment I looked at my reflection and thought, maybe he'll notice. Maybe they all will. They didn't. Daniel walked in late, tie crooked shirt stained from the morning's errands. Claire was already unpacking snacks for the kids. Nathan was buried in a call with a client. The house filled with noise, but not one sound was for me. Still I smiled. Refilled drinks. Passed around the fruit salad. Laughed on cue. That's what mothers do, right? About halfway through the meal, Claire reached for a muffin. Took a bite. paused. "Mom," she said, scrunching her nose, "these are dry. Did you mess with the recipe?" The words were casual, not cruel, but they sliced straight through me. I opened my mouth to respond, but Daniel beat me to it. "She's always had a talent for making sawdust taste homemade." He chuckled. Nathan smirked. Claire laughed a little too. And I swallowed something harder than pride. "Same recipe I've always used," I said softly. "Maybe it's the altitude." It wasn't the muffins. It was me. I had become the wallpaper of their lives there, but never seen. Never quite noticed unless something went wrong. When Claire dropped her fork, I bent to pick it up. When Nathan spilled juice, I rushed for a towel. When Daniel complained the coffee was too weak, I apologized and brewed another pot. All while my heart sat quietly in the corner untouched, unnoticed. After everyone left, I stood at the sink with my hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing the same plates I'd washed 1,000 times before. Same kitchen, same garden view, same ache in my chest. I heard laughter drifting from the front yard. Daniel and Nathan talking about stocks, Claire chasing the kids. It was like watching a life I'd built carry on without me. And suddenly I realized I wasn't part of the story anymore. I was the woman behind the camera, the one who made sure the light hit right. The food was warm, the napkins folded, but who never appeared in the photograph. Not because they cropped me out, but because I never stepped in. That night, after the house fell silent, I didn't cry. I sat in bed, opened my journal, and wrote, "Today I hosted a brunch for my family." They laughed. They talked. They smiled. I don't think anyone saw me. And for the first time, the ache in my chest had a name. Not sadness, not anger, but invisibility. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it. The house was quiet again. The brunch dishes were washed and put away. The scent of lavender cleaner clung to the countertops. The floor was swept. The flowers in the vase on the table had already begun to droop. It was all back to normal, which ironically had become the most painful part. Daniel sat on the porch with a beer, remote in one hand, silence in the other. I stood in the hallway for a moment, watching the sun slip down behind the trees. The golden light reached toward me like it was trying to touch something I hadn't felt in years. And that's when I knew it wasn't a moment of rage. It wasn't born from humiliation or drama. It was something quieter, deeper, like a decision that had waited patiently for me to arrive. I walked upstairs, opened my suitcase again, and placed one final item inside. A folded note. Just 5 words on a small square of paper. "I'm not angry. I'm done." I left it on the kitchen counter. Not out of cruelty, not as a message, just a marker for myself to say, I was here, I mattered, and I left with dignity. I didn't expect Daniel to find it. I didn't even expect him to notice I was gone until the towels started piling up or he couldn't find the mustard. But I wrote it anyway. That night I lay in bed fully dressed, shoes by the door, keys in my purse, journal beside me. I couldn't sleep. At 3, soaram. I sat up, turned on the lamp, and pulled out the journal. I flipped through pages like a woman looking for the moment she stopped breathing. There were letters to Daniel I'd written but never dared speak aloud. Some were silly. "You bought the wrong cereal again." But I said thank you anyway. Some were quiet heartbreaks. "You forgot my birthday this year. You said work was insane." I said it was okay. It wasn't. But one letter stopped me. No date. No greeting. Just, "If I disappeared tomorrow, would you even notice the difference?" I had written that one with a pen that bled through the page. Like even the ink wanted someone to notice. I closed the journal and sat in silence. The kind that's heavy enough to drown in. And then I stood up, took the suitcase from the closet, carried it downstairs. Daniel was snoring in his recliner. TV still on, half-drunk bottle of beer sweating on the table beside him. I watched him for a moment, not with hatred, not even with disappointment, just clarity. He hadn't ruined me. He'd just stopped showing up, stopped seeing me, and I had stayed quietly until I forgot what being seen felt like. I placed the folded note next to the coffee pot, right where he used to leave mine. Then I opened the front door. The air was cool. The sky was a deep indigo, and I stepped outside, not like I was leaving something, but like I was finally returning to myself, The guest room at Helen's house was small, a twin bed with a quilted blanket, a ceramic lamp shaped like a seashell, and a window that let the moonlight pour in like silver. I hadn't stayed here in years. Last time it was after my gallbladder surgery. Helen had fussed over me with soup and crossword puzzles and herbal tea I never finished. This time there was no surgery, at least not the kind you could see. Still, she welcomed me the same. No questions. Just, your room's made up. There's fresh towels. I'll be asleep, but if you need anything, just knock. I didn't need anything, except maybe to feel like I existed again. At 3, the silence became too loud. I got up, wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders, sat at the little wooden desk by the window. The journal rested there beside the lamp, quiet and waiting. I opened to a blank page, tried to write. Nothing came. Not yet. So I flipped back instead. Page after page of unsent letters, some angry, some pleading, some just empty. And then I found one tucked between two others, loose like it had fallen out and been forgotten. The edges were soft, the ink slightly smudged at the corners. At the top in my handwriting, October 7, 1998, that fall. Claire had just started high school. Nathan had broken his wrist playing soccer. Daniel was working late most nights trying to expand the shop. And I was disappearing slowly beneath carpools and casseroles. I read the letter aloud in a whisper just to see if the words still belonged to me. Tonight you came home late again. You said you were tired. You barely looked at me. And I told you I understood. But what I didn't say was this. I miss you. I miss us. I miss feeling like more than the woman who folds your socks. I need you to remember I'm here. I paused, stared out the window at the soft sway of the trees, and I whispered back to my younger self, I remember, I still do. Tears came, not heavy, not choking, just soft, like rain that had waited too long to fall. I didn't cry because of Daniel. I cried for the woman I used to be, the one who kept showing up, kept smiling, kept writing letters she never sent, hoping someone would hear her without having to shout. Rock bottom doesn't always look like falling to the floor. Sometimes it looks like sitting in a tidy room, holding a journal that knows you better than your husband ever did, and realizing you've spent decades trying not to take up too much space. That night, I didn't write a new entry. Not yet. Instead, I gently folded the 1998 letter, placed it inside the back pocket of the journal, pressed my hand flat against the cover. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need revenge. I just needed to remember that I had a voice. And now, I was ready to use it. It was early afternoon when I arrived at the cabin. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as I turned off the main road. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I rolled down the window and just breathed. The cabin had been my Aunt Lillian's. She left it to me years ago, tucked away in a line of her will no one else seemed to care about. Daniel never liked it. Too far. Too cold. Too much work, he'd say. Every time I brought it up, he'd dismiss it, roll his eyes, tell me it was a fantasy, that it was more trouble than it's worth. But that day, as the cabin came into view, aged but standing, weathered but strong, I didn't see trouble. I saw freedom. I parked, turned off the engine, and just sat. The quiet was different here. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence of peace. No buzzing phone, no footsteps pacing, no unanswered questions in a shared kitchen. Just the wind in the trees, the creak of old wood, and the steady, sure thrum of my own breath. I stepped inside. The air held that mix of dust and cedar like stories had been waiting for someone to open the door again. The furniture was simple, a little sagging. The curtains were yellowed. The floorboards sighed under my feet. But it felt more like home than my house ever had. There was a small table by the window, a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks, a fireplace that hadn't been used in years, and above the sink a tiny window that framed a single birch tree standing proudly in the clearing. I unpacked slowly, placed my journal on the table, laid out my cardigan over the back of a chair, took off my shoes, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I let my shoulders drop. That night, I built a small fire. It took 3 tries and more matches than I'd like to admit, but eventually flames curled upward, soft and golden. I sat on the floor wrapped in a blanket, eating crackers and cheese from a paper plate. And I laughed, not loudly, not at anything in particular, but at the strange joy of doing something just for me. Daniel would have hated it. Too rustic, too inconvenient. But here's the thing about starting over. You stop asking if someone else would approve. You just listen to your own breath and ask, is this what I want? And that night, on an old floor beside a crackling fire with the moon peeking through a dusty window, my answer was yes. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. No alarm, no footsteps in the hallway, no coffee brewing downstairs for someone else. Just me. The air inside the cabin was cool fresh. I made tea on the old stovetop and stood by the tiny window sipping slowly, watching the mist rise from the trees. And for a moment, I didn't feel alone. I felt still. After breakfast, I decided to drive into town. Nothing urgent, just a grocery run. But this time, I wasn't shopping to fill someone else's plate. I was shopping for me. I parked in front of the little co-op market near the main square. There was a chalkboard sign out front that read, "Fresh blueberries $2.99. You deserve something sweet." I smiled. It felt like a message left just for me. Inside, the shelves were cozy and mismatched. A woman offered me a sample of local honey. Another greeted me with a nod and a quiet, "Beautiful day, isn't it?" It was. I wandered the aisles without urgency, humming softly to a song I didn't recognize playing overhead. And for the first time in years, I didn't check my phone, didn't wonder what Daniel needed, didn't try to remember if Nathan liked sourdough or multigrain. I picked up what I wanted: goat cheese, basil, a tiny bottle of white wine, fresh raspberries, and a lavender-scented soap I would have once considered too indulgent. I carried the basket like it was full of tiny rebellions. Except it wasn't rebellion, it was restoration. At checkout, I caught my reflection in the cooler door across from me. Same face, same cardigan. But there was something different in the way I stood. My shoulders weren't curled inward. My chin wasn't tilted down. I looked present, like I had finally stepped into the frame. The cashier smiled as she rang up the groceries. "Having people over?" she asked. I paused, then smiled back. "No, just me," she nodded. "Sounds like the best kind of company." As I walked out with my bag, the wind caught the corner of the receipt, fluttering it like a ribbon. And I realized, for most of my life, I had shopped with a mental list of other people's preferences, their breakfasts, their favorites, their convenience. But not today. Today, I bought raspberries just because I love how they burst on the tongue. Today, I said yes to wine without a special occasion. Today, I left space in the fridge just for me. It didn't feel like an act of defiance. It felt like breathing again. Back at the cabin, I unpacked slowly, placed everything in their new homes, lit a candle, poured a glass of wine, and sat on the porch as the sun warmed my shoulders. I wasn't running away. I was walking towards something, someone, me. It was late afternoon. The light slanted across the cabin floor in golden stripes, and I had just finished writing a letter to no one in particular. Just thoughts, breaths, a kind of softness I hadn't allowed myself in years. The phone buzzed once. A missed call. Daniel. I stared at the screen. Didn't move. Let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, it buzzed again. Same name. Another missed call. And then the voicemail came. I didn't press play right away. I wasn't sure I even wanted to. But something in me, the part that once waited by the window for his headlights in the driveway, still leaned in. I tapped the message. His voice filled the small cabin. "Hi, it's me." Pause. I found the notebook. The leather one. Another pause, longer this time. I read some of it. Not all, but enough. There was a quiver in his voice, subtle like a man not used to sounding uncertain. "I didn't know Margaret. I really didn't. I mean, I knew we were drifting, but I didn't realize you were hurting that much. I didn't realize how long it had been, how much I missed." Another silence. The kind that holds more than words. If I had known, maybe I would have done things differently, or at least looked at you more. He cleared his throat, and in that one gesture, familiar, clumsy, I felt the weight of years. "I'm not calling to ask you to come home. I know you need space, but I just wanted to say, that I saw you, Margaret. In those pages, and I'm sorry I didn't see you sooner. Click. Message ended. I stared at the screen, waiting for, I don't know what. Tears? Relief. But what I felt was something else entirely. Not anger. Not triumph. Not hope. I felt calm. Because finally it wasn't me who had to explain. Wasn't me who had to plead to be seen. He saw. Too late. But still he saw. And yet, I didn't call back. Not out of spite. Not out of pride. But because I no longer needed his voice to validate mine. I sat on the porch with my tea cooling beside me, the voicemail still fresh in my ears. And for the first time I thought, this story isn't about whether he regrets losing me. It's about how I stopped regretting loving myself too late. The sun dipped lower. Birds chattered in the trees. The world kept turning. And I stayed still, not stuck, but grounded. 3 days passed after Daniel's voicemail. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The cabin became quieter, and in that quiet I found pieces of myself I hadn't heard in decades. I rearranged the kitchen shelves, hung my robe by the back door like I belonged there. Started writing not letters this time, but small stories, memories, moments. Then one evening, just as I was slicing pears for dinner, my phone buzzed on the windowsill. Claire. I dried my hands. Picked it up. A text. Dad says you're not answering. Are you okay? I stared at the message for a long while. The old version of me would have responded immediately. I'm fine. Just resting. Everything's okay. But this version, the one who lit her own candles and picked raspberries because she liked them, paused. And wrote, I'm okay. I just don't want to keep pretending I'm not hurt. I hit send. Then turned off the phone, not to silence the world, but to let that one sentence breathe. The next morning, I found myself walking the trail behind the cabin. It led to a small clearing with a fallen log that made for a perfect seat. I sat there, journal in hand, thinking about all the roles I'd played. Wife, mother, housekeeper, peacekeeper, but rarely just Margaret. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. I expected Daniel, but it was Claire. Can I come see you? That afternoon, her car pulled up the gravel path. She stepped out slowly like she wasn't sure what she'd find. She looked older than I remembered, not in years, but in awareness. We hugged gently, carefully, like two people who knew what it meant to bruise quietly. Inside, we sat at the small kitchen table. I poured us both tea. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Claire said, I read what Dad showed me. I didn't know. Mom, I didn't know it was like that. Her voice cracked. I thought you were fine. You always seemed fine. I smiled, not bitterly, but with a kind of motherly softness. That's the thing about women like me, Claire. We're trained to seem fine, even when we're slowly fading. She reached across the table and took my hand. I'm sorry, she whispered. I should have asked how you were. I should have seen you. I didn't cry. I'd already done my crying. What I did feel, finally, was something I hadn't felt from her in years. Recognition. We spent the afternoon planting lavender near the porch. It was messy. We got dirt on our jeans. One of the roots snapped in half, and we laughed until we nearly dropped the pot. That night, over a simple dinner, she said, You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. And I replied, I think I'm just starting to believe that myself. Claire left the next morning. She hugged me tightly before getting into her car, and for once, neither of us said, Take care, like it was a goodbye. It felt more like a beginning. That afternoon, Daniel called again. I let it ring. Then I listened to his voicemail. I'm sorry for everything. I know that's not enough, but if you ever want to come talk, or just get the rest of your things, I'll be here. There was something different in his voice this time. Not desperation, not defense, just a quiet unraveling. The sound of a man who realized the floor beneath him had always been held up by someone else's silence. I waited 2 more days. Then I drove back to the house. Not to return, not to argue, but to retrieve what I had left behind. As I pulled into the driveway, everything looked the same. The overgrown hedges, the faded shutters, the cracked bird bath Claire gave us on our 25th anniversary. But I felt different. I didn't hesitate at the front door. Didn't pause on the steps like I used to, rehearsing kindness or bracing for dismissal. I knocked once. Daniel opened the door. And for the first time in years, he looked small, not in stature, but in presence, like someone who had been holding his breath too long. "I didn't think you'd actually come," he said quietly. "I didn't think you'd actually ask," I replied. We stood there for a moment, the air between us thick with memories neither of us wanted to unpack. Then I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, lemon cleaner, faint old wood. But everything felt dimmer, like the walls knew I didn't belong to them anymore. We didn't sit. We didn't hug. I walked to the living room, where my books still lined the bottom shelf. I had left them because I didn't think they mattered, but now I wanted them back. Not for nostalgia, but because they were mine. Daniel stood behind me. "I read more of the journal," he said, voice low. "I didn't know how much you were carrying, how much I missed." I didn't look at him. I just kept sorting books into a box. "I tried to tell you," I said, "not with yelling, not with threats, but with gestures, with hope." He didn't interrupt. "Just let the words sit. You used to leave me notes," he said suddenly. "Little ones. On the fridge. In my toolbox. I kept them." I paused. "But you stopped," he added. "No," I said, turning to face him. "I just stopped writing ones you'd never read." His eyes welled. "Not with performance. With something deeper." He looked around the room. "I thought you were just always going to be there. Like the roof. Like the floors. I didn't realize you had an end." That hurt more than I expected it to. But I didn't let it take root. "I didn't end," I said. "I evolved. I stepped out of the role you assigned me." He stepped back slightly, as if that truth needed space. "We didn't fight. We didn't shout. It was stranger than that. It was quiet. Clear. Almost holy. A woman who had spent nearly 4 decades disappearing, now standing in the middle of the same living room. Seen. You were whole," he whispered. And I think I resented that. I nodded. "I know." And in that moment, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. It had been almost a week since I visited the house. Since Daniel and I stood in the same room, not as husband and wife, but as two people finally speaking a language we had forgotten how to use. Truth. I returned to the cabin. Claire called once to check in. Nathan sent a photo of a dog he was thinking of adopting. And Daniel was quiet. I thought that might be the end of it, until the envelope came. It was slipped into Helen's mailbox, no return address, no postage stamp, just my name. Margaret, handwritten in blocky, familiar letters. Inside, a single page, lined paper, torn from one of the yellow legal pads Daniel always kept in the garage. His handwriting was shaky, not rushed, but uncertain, like each word had to fight its way past something. "Margaret, I don't know how to apologize for 38 years of missed chances. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know I read every line you wrote. And I saw what I didn't see before. I saw you." My hands trembled slightly as I continued. "I saw the woman who kept showing up, who cooked dinners, even when no one said thank you, who remembered my mother's birthday, when I forgot, who loved our children, without asking for credit, who smiled through everything I took for granted." I stopped reading for a moment. Let the silence fill the space between what I once needed and what I no longer did. Then I finished. "I don't know if this is the end of our story, but if it is, thank you for being the best chapter of mine. Daniel." No theatrics, no begging. Just paper and ink and truth delivered quietly. I folded the letter, not out of fear it might crease, but out of respect. I didn't cry. I didn't feel pulled back or swayed. But I felt something gentler than closure. Release. Later that evening, I made tea, lit a candle, sat on the porch with my journal in my lap. I didn't open it. I didn't need to write just yet. Instead, I stared out across the woods and thought, he finally saw me. Not in time to keep me, but in time to lose me with grace. And sometimes that's more than we ever get. Spring arrived quietly at the cabin. The lavender Claire and I planted weeks ago had begun to sprout, tentative at first, then certain. Just like her voice when she called to say, "I'm coming up this weekend, Mom. I just want to spend time." She arrived Saturday morning, hair pulled back, a basket of groceries in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "I thought we could cook," she said, smiling. "Like we used to when I was little, before I started insisting I knew better than you." I laughed, really laughed. Not politely, not for anyone else's comfort, but for myself. That afternoon, we chopped vegetables side by side, elbow to elbow. Claire sliced faster than me. I teased her about it. She rolled her eyes but didn't stop smiling. No one raised voices. No one needed to be right. We ate dinner on the porch. 2 women, 2 generations, and finally no performance. She told me about work. I told her about a watercolor class I'd joined on Wednesdays. She looked surprised. You never used to do stuff like that. I didn't used to be this version of me, I replied. She nodded. Didn't question it. Didn't mourn who I'd been. And I realized something in that moment. Claire hadn't just come to visit. She'd come to witness. Later that night, we sat with our feet tucked under old blankets, sipping tea as the stars came out. She was quiet for a while, then said, "You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." I didn't brush it off. Didn't deflect. I just held her gaze. "Thank you," I said. "I hope you grow into the kind of woman who doesn't disappear." She reached for my hand. I already started. In the distance, the wind stirred the trees. The wind chimes on the porch sang a melody I didn't recognize, but somehow knew by heart. The world hadn't changed. Daniel hadn't rewritten history. The wounds hadn't vanished. But something softer had taken root. Not forgiveness exactly, not forgetting, just peace. And peace, I was learning, is what grows when you stop watering what was never meant to bloom. It was nearly dusk when I found myself sitting at the same desk where weeks before I had whispered through ink the truths I couldn't yet speak. The journal lay open before me, the final page untouched, waiting. Outside the cabin, the wind stirred gently. The lavender swayed, humming a song only the healed could hear. I dipped my pen and began. Dear Margaret. Not Daniel, not Claire, not anyone else. Just me. You did it. You left without slamming the door. You spoke without screaming. You healed without an audience. You remembered who you are without needing anyone else to confirm it. You thought this chapter would be about leaving him, but it was about returning to you. I paused, let the stillness settle, then wrote the last line. This isn't the end of your story. It's the first time it fully belongs to you. I signed it, folded the page, slid it into the back of the journal like a seed being planted. Not to hide, but to root. Later that evening, I walked barefoot out to the porch. The air was cool, the sky painted in violets and gold, and I stood there with the journal in my hands, pressing it to my chest, not like a burden, but like a quiet declaration. Daniel would always be part of my history, but he no longer got to narrate my worth. Claire was growing into the kind of woman who asked questions, who listened, who saw, and I was growing too, not backwards toward who I had been, but forward into the version of myself that had waited patiently in the corners of my silence. And maybe one day, if someone asks me what changed, I'll say this. One day I stopped shrinking so others could stand taller. I stopped whispering when I needed to be heard, and I wrote myself a letter, and finally read it. I stepped back into the cabin, closed the door softly behind me, and let the quiet be enough, because this time, the silence belonged to me. If you've ever waited too long to be seen, or stayed too long where you felt invisible, this story was for you. Subscribe to this channel for more stories where women reclaim their voices, one quiet revolution at a time. Because some goodbyes are not endings, they are awakenings.